Hi everyone. We're going to be learning how to make facings. You can't have a raw edge of a dress just turned under and stitched down. That's very unprofessional looking. Sometimes you'll see it in the knit industry that they do it, and because the fabric's stretchy, it's been serged and just turned under and pressed and stitched. But that's the very minimal and entry-level clothing. Anything that's a nicer garment generally will have a facing. So there is a video that you can watch that I uploaded called Facings, What, Where, and Why. Hopefully you might remember something about facings from your basic construction course. We did have you make a sample with a facing. If you made a skirt in your class, you would have had a facing on it. Unfortunately, the button-down collar shirt did not have a facing, so you may or may not have had some experience with facings. And so to do this, what I want you to do is get your pattern that you made for your sloper, the full-scale one. I think it'll be easier for you guys to see what I'm doing if we're working in a larger scale. So I'm going to tuck this under for now. We're going to start with the neck area. So you're going to need some tracing paper. Most of the time, the best way to do a facing is going to be to trace it, because it has to fit the garment, and so you're taking the facing right off of the pattern for your garment. So I've got a piece of tracing paper here, and I'm going to put it up over that neck area right here. And you're going to start by tracing off your front edge. And generally a facing is going to vary somewhere between 1.5 to 2 inches in depth. So for this facing, we're going to be doing a separate facing for the neck and a separate one for the arm. And then we'll do one where it's all one continuous piece. So 2 different styles. So you want this to be, I like about a 2-inch facing. So from the seam allowance to the bottom of the facing is 2 inches, but you're going to need a seam, so you can just trace right over your seams. So make sure that this is 2 inches here. Oops, my pen is running out of ink. There we go. And the same thing over here at the shoulder. It's 2 inches from the seam. So there's 2. And then I'm going to go up here to my, and I'm just going to go ahead and, well, we'll skip that for the moment because I forgot I got to make an adjustment. And then you trace off your neck edge. Keep in mind that the edge here of your seam and your seam allowance at the very center front should be horizontal and straight. So it's a good idea to just kind of notch that area, make it straight, and then, oops, sorry, I bumped the camera, and trace off this neck edge. You can do it with that armhole ruler. You can, I'm just using a French curve I have here. And then I'm going to mark 2 inches in each direction, just little notches, little lines, so I know where that 2 inches is coming around in a circle. And the one thing that we have to do at the area of the shoulder is we're going to be taking a little bit of fabric away, so that when your facing turns in, if it's exactly the same size, it's the same theory with the collar turning. The inside needs to be slightly smaller than the outside so that your fabric doesn't wind up getting a wrinkle in it. We're going to go over here to the sleeve, and I'm also going to draw that 2-inch mark. and come down here 2 inches. Oops, I don't have a big enough piece of paper. Hang on. So 2 inches under the arm. And I'm just going to go ahead and mark a few little dots telling me where the 2-inch width is all the way around. You really want nice consistent sizing. They'll look better. Okay. I'm going to put in my armhole. So at this point, what we want to do is we want to take merely a 1/16 of an inch off the end of the facing. In order for this to be able to sew and fit, it needs to be the same length, but we're going to take a little bit of fabric off here and here so that we don't have too much fabric inside the garment when we turn it right side out. So I'm going to come down here a 1/16 of an inch, and you can see it's only that much, 1/2 of an eighth. And I'm going to angle my shoulder seam down. So I'm just going to put a little hash mark through those because it doesn't matter anymore. I don't want to make a mistake when I'm drafting the seam allowance. Under the arm, we generally take about 1/8 of an inch. So 1/8 of an inch is about that much right there. And again, it's going to angle back up because our seams have to match when we go to sew them. This seam is going to be separate. The facing is separate from the garment. So then you simply just connect everything. Same thing in the front. Again, I like to make sure that my front edge is straight. So for at least 1/4 of an inch, I come in straight. You want to really avoid this going up to a point, and I see that happen quite often when people are new to pattern drafting. So then you just want to add your seam allowances back in. So here, our seam allowance, because we dropped down 1/8 of an inch, remember it's going to drop down here at the top. Everything else will stay the same. Square it up here. Do the same thing over here on the side. Draft that new seam allowance. Square this up too. We don't want it to go up to a point or up to a point right here. And then draw in your seam allowance. You may have to mark your seam allowance first. Don't assume that you automatically can do a 1/2 inch easily. I've just been doing it for so long that sometimes I skip steps, which I got to remind you guys not to do. I have a little trouble with the curved ruler here because I've got a computer set up and camera and everything, so I don't have as much room to work as I would like. Then what we want to do is we want to have notches. So on your armhole, you do already have a notch in this location, so just extend it through. You're copying it. And the reason you even had the notch on the bodice was for adding a sleeve or adding a facing. And then you can do the same thing somewhere on the neck. You can add a notch. Now, obviously, if we had a V-neck here, our facing would follow that V-neck edge. I'm just going to have you guys do these basic facings. So this, you want to remember also that we need to put grain line on here. So the grain line and the fact that this front facing at the neck is cut on the fold just like the garment is. We don't want to put a seam there and make it bulky. So this is cut on fold. So thereby you're going to cut one. Make sure that you have a grain line. So this neckline facing, the grain lines, you're going to come over about 1 inch from the center front and just mark it. Hopefully when you're folding things, you'll fold the fabric on grain. So this is your front facing. So it's the bodice, front facing. You don't add any seam allowance here because there is no seam. You would be putting interfacing under here. If we were going to be doing a lined garment, we would not have this facing end here. The facing would come and do this. And then that's where we would add seam allowance. So we're going to do that one next. So hopefully, now the facing, the straight of grain is this way. So we want to do the same thing over here. We want to keep this straight of grain on the facing. And so then this is the bodice, front armhole facing. You would cut two because you have, a right and a left. Because this one's on the fold, you're only going to cut one. So that's it for the front facings. And I'm going to have you do the back too. We got a little change to make in the back. So for the back, we're going to do pretty much the same thing. We're going to come down 2 inches, the center back seam. Oops, I got to come down here. I'm not going to have enough. There we go. Two inches. And do the same thing under the arm, 2 inches. At the shoulders, we're doing the same thing that we did on the front pattern. So before you even draw it, you could go ahead. You can see that the 2 inches is going to be right here. We're going to get lucky and we're going to miss the dart, so we don't have to make an accommodation for the dart. But we're going to come down 1/16 of an inch here. So we're just taking, it's just a slight amount. When you sew the two together, it's really actually 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to put a little note on here because I don't want you guys to forget. So here's where the 2 inches come down 1/16 of an inch, which is right here. So here we came down 1/16. And under the arm, it would have been 1/8 of an inch. So before I finish this over here, I want to take that 1/8 of an inch off. So it's coming in here. You don't want to take more because then your facing is going to be too small. So this is 1/8 of an inch that we went in that direction. And then you're just going to go all around and mark your armhole. Mark your neckline. Again, always making sure that this is a 90-degree square. You don't want it to swoop up. And then just take a ruler and go all the way around and mark 2 inches. So here's 2. You can do it with a tape measure. Connect that all together. Don't forget to put your notches. So somewhere on the back neck, you can put some notches. A lot of times this is so short that I don't bother. So add your seam allowances. Don't forget grain lines. The grain line here should run lengthwise. Same thing over here. So you'll see that your grain line is running lengthwise of the bodice and not necessarily all of a sudden going this way and doing that to your, you're not just running the full length of the facing. So add your seam allowances. Now in the back here, if you've had a 1-inch seam allowance because you want to have enough fabric for the zipper, make sure you take and extend that out too. So whatever dimension your seam allowance is in the back, make sure it's the same. So add your seam allowances all around, mark your facings, and then you'll photograph both sets and submit them to the assignment on Canvas. So we're going to complete one other facing, and it's what's referred to as a combined facing. If this was going to be a sleeveless dress, we wouldn't want to have the opening between the two facings. We want to completely cover this area so that when you're wearing it, the facings don't pop out to the outside. This kind of a facing, you can draft a pattern for a lining if you wanted to have a fully lined dress. So there's lots of reasons why you would do this little bit more complicated facing. And one of the things that remains the same is we still have to remove 1/8 of an inch at the shoulder, but not going in this direction up here, but coming in this direction, because when you put the facing inside, if the fabric's the same size, sometimes it rolls to the outside and you can see it. So we want to make sure that it just slightly rolls to the inside. So we're going to take 1/8 inch off under the arm also. So we're going to, in the underarm area, still come down only about 2 inches. And then typically your facing kind of comes around and follows the armhole and then goes off and around to the center front. We don't want this to be too long because there's the bust in here and you've got excess fabric. So a lot of times it's generally, hang on. So in the center front, I'm going to bring it down 2 inches. You can bring it a little further sometimes, but again, you're going to get too much fabric laying over top of the bust and it's going to be uncomfortable to wear. So I'm just going to bring in a little like 1/2 inch line here and a 1/2 inch line here. Square it up to the side seams. And you sort of have to kind of make up this shape with a rounded ruler. And I'm going to come around under the arm and mark where the 2 inch is. Here's 2 inches, as if I was coming around to do the entire facing, because basically I'm joining these 2 facings together. So I'm going to mark this mark for the, so it's going to come up and I'm going to go across. So sometimes it helps to just kind of draw a horizontal line coming out. And this facing here is going to connect. So this is the part that we're curving together. So I'm going to come down and curve to my underarm, get that part first. I'm going to continue up. And then I'm going to curve into the front. Bring it down into my facing here. That looks pretty good. And again, when you're doing a fitting, you could, this line could be drawn on your muslin, and then you could look to see if it is in a good location or is it going to be an awkward fit there. So our center front stays the same. We don't do anything there. But here at the shoulder, we're going to bring this in 1/8 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch over there. So make those marks, and 1/8 of an inch down here at the bottom. So here we would go right to the seam allowance at the armhole and the side seam, but then we're angling it down 1/8 of an inch. And one of the reasons, if you think about it, when you sew the side seam and you press the fabric open, that fabric is taking up some space. So if these are exactly the same size, it's going to make the facing have a ripple in it. So we're just removing enough to accommodate the seam allowances that are going to be laying under there. Same thing here with the arm's eye. Let me use my metal one. I'm coming from the underarm around, and I'm just changing that angle to accommodate that 1/8 of an inch that we're taking away. And do the same thing at the neck edge. And remember, at the neck edge here, for at least 1/4 of an inch, make sure that that's straight horizontal. We don't want it to swoop up. There we go. Don't forget that you have notches here that you made before. You want to keep those the same. And I'm going to join this together at the shoulder. And then you can go ahead and add your seam allowances. So here's seam allowance. Don't forget to take that 1/8 of an inch off in the seam allowance. Oh. Oh boy. So add your 1/2 inch seam allowance here, here, and then mark that new 1/2 inch because we took away the 1/8 of an inch, and go around and mark your armhole seam allowance. And this is usually referred to as an all-in-one facing. If we're just using it as a facing, we don't add any seam allowance at the bottom because you're not attaching anything to it. If we were going to be attaching a lining, you would draft the lining from this line, and then you would add a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the facing, and then you would go upward on the lining with a 1/2 an inch, and this would be the line that you would be stitching on. So it gets a little bit complicated, but these look really, really nice inside the garment. So this is your front facing, all in one. Your seam allowance should follow this front edge as being straight. So you can come way over, though, and put your seam allowance like here so that you can see it better. On that seam allowance, I'm sorry, grain line. And then remember that this is cut on the fold here. And then we're going to do the one in the back, which is going to be a little tricky because there's a dart at the shoulder. So here when we go to do the back, it's a little more challenging because we got to remember to close the dart. If we were to put a dart in our facing, you would have a lot of extra fabric laying on top of each other. If you think about it, a dart folded over, you've got 4 layers of fabric, and then you do it to the facing. Now you've got 8 layers of fabric in that location. It's kind of thick. So we want to remember to close the dart. We're going to, at this neck edge, we're going to take this 1/8 of an inch because that's what we did in the front. We also did it here. And we did it here. So I'm going to start at the top. And again, we're going to, in the back, you can sometimes do your center back facing a little bit longer. It really helps capture the top of the zipper if there's a zipper there. And that can be more like about 4 inches long. So if you come from the seam allowance down, here's 4 inches. So it's a little bit longer. And I'm just squaring off the seam and the seam allowance at the top there. And then I'm going to square this off about 1/2 inch. If you want to follow around in the book, I forgot to mention, I think earlier, that this is on, starts on page 366. And so then we're going to work our way over to where the dart is. So I'm going to be bringing in this neckline 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to mark that first. So it's going to come in here, but it's going to follow the same curve. And then I'm going to be coming over to the dart, and I'm going to stop right at the dart. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to do my neckline. So you still want your neckline to remain straight at the center back, but then you're bringing it over a little bit right there. So we're just dropping it down. Maybe it could have been a little more curved. There. And so then what you're going to do is you're going to rotate your pattern. I'm sticking a pin in it for now till I loosen it here. Okay. So I'm going to bring it over to the other side of that dart. So basically what I'm doing is closing the dart. So make sure you're on the seam. Make sure this has remained horizontal, that you didn't skew anything. And I'm going to actually tack it down so it doesn't move at this point. And then I'm going to come across my seam. So basically your seam should be kind of straight. And I'm coming in 1/8 of an inch here. And I'm going to come in 1/8 of an inch. At the armhole, we're going to go down 2 inches, like we did in the front. And we're coming over 1/8 of an inch, which is right here. So this seam will go like this. Okay. I can add my armhole back in. So everything on the armhole remains the same, except for that you took 1/8 of an inch off at the shoulder. So that looks pretty good. And now we need to bring these together. So I'm going to mark where the 2 inch is on my This would be my, if I had a separate sleeve facing, and then here's the center back. So we want this to kind of come together and go under the arm. So a lot of times I take a pencil, and I try to sketch a couple of lines to see which I think looks better. So probably like right about here would be good. And then come back around under the arm. There we go. So then you're going to add your seam allowances. I think I have a 1-inch seam allowance here on the back. Don't forget your grain line. So there is no dart in the facing. We've eliminated that dart. And I'm going to go ahead in a minute and fold that in and see if it looks like it fits right. Don't forget your notches. So before I add all my seam allowances, I'm going to go ahead and just double check that this really fits the pattern well. So I'm going to fold in my dart. So I'm just going to take a look at that shoulder line and make sure that it follows the shoulder line of the garment. Yeah, that looks pretty good. There's a little bit being taken off here, a little bit being taken off there, so it's going to fit really well. So then add your seam allowances, make sure you have all your notches, your grain line, and this is the all-in-one facing. And you would cut two. The front you cut one because you're cutting it on the fold, so here you're cutting two. So this is the back, for the back bodice though. So get all of those finished and photograph them and upload them to the assignment, and that will be it for doing necklines, collars, and facings.